Hello everyone, welcome back to Insomnia Protocol. Tonight, we have another terrifying horror story for you. Before we start, please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave a comment below. Now, get ready, and let's dive in. I work for a company that installs cell towers in places most people never think about. The kind of job where you spend more nights in a truck than in your own bed. And that Friday, I was 3 hours behind schedule because a tower outside of Ridgeline had a bracket that would not seat right no matter how many times I climbed back up to check it. By the time I got it fixed, the sky had already gone that deep orange color it gets right before the light disappears completely, and I still had a 2-hour drive ahead of me through the kind of back roads that do not show up right on any map app. I am not a reckless person. My mother raised me to plan things out, to check the weather, to keep a full tank of gas. But that day I had let the tank get lower than I should have, and about 40 minutes into the drive back the check engine light came on, and the truck started losing power on the hills. I pulled over on a gravel shoulder next to a tree line, popped the hood, and stood there in the cooling air, trying to figure out if I even knew what I was looking at. Which I did not. Not really, I just knew enough to know something under there was wrong in a way I could not fix with a wrench and a flashlight. My phone had one bar, enough to see the call fail twice before I gave up trying to reach a tow service, and enough to see that the nearest town was 11 miles back the way I had come, which was not a walk I wanted to take in the dark with coyotes calling somewhere off in the hills. I grabbed my bag, my flashlight, and started walking anyway, because sitting in a dead truck on the side of an empty road felt worse than moving, even if moving meant I had no real plan. About a mile and I saw a break in the tree line, a narrow dirt path that looked like had once been a driveway, grown over now with weeds pushing up through old gravel. And at the end of it, maybe 200 yards back from the road, there was a cabin. It was not falling apart the way I expected an abandoned place to look. The roof was intact, the windows were not broken, and there was a porch light fixture still hanging by the door, even though the bulb inside it was long dead. I stood at the edge of that driveway for a good minute weighing it out. A stranger walking up to an empty cabin in the woods at night is not something anyone would call smart. But the wind had picked up and the temperature was dropping fast, and 11 more miles on foot with a storm coming in was its own kind of unsafe. I walked up, knocked twice out of habit even though I did not expect an answer. And when nothing came back, I tried the door and found it unlocked, swinging open easy on hinges that did not even creak. Inside it smelled like dust and old wood smoke, but it was dry, and there was furniture, a couch with a folded quilt on the arm, a kitchen table with 2 chairs pushed in neat, a fireplace with a small stack of split logs beside it that looked freshly cut, not decades old like everything else. I told myself someone probably used this place for hunting season and would not mind a stranded traveler crashing on the couch for one night. That was the story I built in my head, because it was the one that let me stop, feeling like I had made a mistake. On the kitchen table, held down by a chipped ceramic mug, there was a single sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges, but the handwriting on it was dark and clear, like it had been written recently with a heavy hand. At the top it said, in block letters, "If you are staying the night, follow these rules exactly." I sat down at that table with my flashlight propped against the mug, and I read it twice through before I let myself believe what it was asking of me. The first line told me the front door had to stay unlocked from sunset until sunrise, that if I locked it I might hear knocking later that night, and that I should not open the door for it, that the knocking would eventually stop on its own. The second line told me never to light the fireplace, no matter how cold the cabin got, and that if I woke up and found it already burning I needed to leave immediately and not look back at the cabin from the road. There were more lines after that, about footsteps upstairs when there was no upstairs, about a voice outside that might call my name in a voice I recognized, about curtains that had to stay closed and what to do if one opened on its own, about counting seconds after a knock, about walking through every room before I left in the morning and never entering a room I did not remember being there when I arrived. I read that last part 3 times, the part about a room I did not remember, because I had already glanced through the doorway to the bedroom and the small door beside the fireplace that I guessed led down to a basement, and I was trying to hold a clear picture in my head of exactly how many rooms this cabin had, so that in the morning I would know. My first instinct, the reasonable adult instinct, was that this was somebody's idea of a joke, a prank for hunters or hikers who wandered in, maybe something a previous guest had written themselves after a long night of drinking. And for about 30 seconds I let myself laugh a little at it, folded the paper back under the mug, and started looking for a dry place to set my bag down. But the wind outside had started making a sound against the windows that did not feel like ordinary wind, a kind of low pressure that came and went in waves instead of a steady gust. And when I looked toward the front door to check that it was shut against the cold, I noticed the latch, an old iron hook and I noticed how easy it would be to flip that hook closed without even thinking about it, the way anyone locks a door behind them out of pure habit before they go to sleep in a strange house. I stood there with my hand actually resting on that cold iron hook for longer than I want to admit, telling myself it was just a piece of paper, that locking a door was the only sane thing to do in an empty cabin in the middle of nowhere, that whoever wrote those rules was probably long gone or never real to begin with. Then I heard it, faint, coming from somewhere out past the tree line. Not the wind, not an animal, something with a rhythm to it, 3 slow knocks, except there was no one at the door yet. The sound was coming from further out, from the dark beyond the porch, like something was already walking toward the cabin and letting me know it was on its way. I took my hand off the latch. I left the door exactly the way I found it, unlocked, and I sat back down at that kitchen table with the paper in front of me and my flashlight aimed at the front door, and I told myself I would stay awake, that I would just wait it out until the sun came up, because whatever choice I had made walking up that driveway, I understood now that I had already stopped being a stranded traveler looking for shelter and started being a guest inside a set of rules I did not write and did not fully understand. I sat there for what felt like a long time before anything else happened, long enough that I started to wonder if the 3 knocks I heard out past the tree line had just been a branch coming loose in the wind, or my own nerves turning an ordinary sound into something worse. The flashlight beam stayed steady on the front door, and the door stayed shut, unlocked the way the rule told me to leave it. And for a while, the only sound in the cabin was the wind pressing against the windows and the small pops of the wood settling somewhere in the walls. I picked the paper back up and read through it again, slower this time, trying to memorize each line instead of just skimming for the parts that scared me. Because if I was going to be stuck here until sunrise, I wanted to know exactly what I was and was not supposed to do. The line about the fireplace stood out to me again, mostly because the cabin was getting colder by the minute, the kind of cold that gets into your hands first. And there was a perfectly good stack of dry split wood sitting right there next to it, which felt almost cruel, like the rule knew exactly what it was asking me to give up. I pulled the quilt off the arm of the couch instead, wrapped it around my shoulders, and moved my chair a little closer to the kitchen table so I could keep both the front door and the hallway to the bedroom in view at the same time. That was when I noticed the small door beside the fireplace again, the one I had guessed led to a basement, and next to it, a narrow set of stairs I had not paid attention to before, tucked into the corner past the bedroom doorway, leading up to what I figured was the attic the rules mentioned. There is no second floor, the paper had said, only a small attic above the bedroom, and I remember thinking that was an oddly specific thing to clarify unless someone expected me to hear something up there and assume otherwise. I did not have to wait long to find out why. It started small, a single creak from somewhere above the bedroom ceiling, the kind of sound an old house makes all the time as the temperature drops, and I almost let myself write it off completely, until it happened again. Then again, this time with a clear rhythm to it, not random settling, but something that sounded exactly like weight shifting from one foot to another. Footsteps. Slow ones moving in a short line back and forth, the way someone paces when they are thinking, or when they are listening for something below them. I stayed exactly where I was at the kitchen table, remembering the rule, if you hear footsteps upstairs, stay downstairs, and I kept my eyes on the ceiling above the bedroom doorway, instead of standing up to look, even though every instinct in me wanted to go check, wanted to prove to myself it was just a raccoon, or a loose shutter banging against the roofline. The footsteps crossed the ceiling once, twice, and then stopped, directly above the spot where the bedroom met the hallway, close enough to where I was sitting that I could feel my own pulse in my ears. If the footsteps stop directly above you, turn off every light and remain completely silent. That was the next part of the rule, and my flashlight was the only light I had, so I clicked it off and set it on the table without a sound, sitting there in a darkness so complete I could not see my own hands in my lap. I do not know how long I sat like that, not moving, barely breathing, listening to nothing but the wind and my own heartbeat. But at some point I became aware of a second sound layered underneath the silence. Something faint, almost like breathing. Except it was not coming from above me anymore. It was coming from the direction of the front door. My chest went tight, and I forced myself to stay still, telling myself it was the wind finding a gap somewhere in the frame, that old cabins breathe like that when a storm pushes against them. But the sound had a pattern to it that wind does not usually have, in and out, slow and even, like something standing just on the other side of that unlocked door was matching its breathing to mine. I do not know how much time passed before the footsteps upstairs started again, but when they did, they moved away from where I was sitting, back toward the far end of the attic space, fading until I could not hear them at all anymore. And only then did I let myself reach for the flashlight, click it back on, keeping the beam low and pointed at the floor so it would not throw light against the windows. The breathing sound by the door was gone too, or maybe it had never really been there at all. Maybe it was just my own mind filling in gaps the same way it had tried to explain away the knocking earlier. But I noticed my hands were shaking when I picked the paper back up, and that was not something my mind had invented. I read further down the page, past the part about the footsteps, to a line about a voice outside calling my name, a voice that might sound exactly like someone I know, and a line right under it in the same heavy handwriting telling me not to answer, not to look through the windows, and never to tell that voice that I knew it was not human. I remember thinking, sitting there in the dark with the quilt pulled tight around my shoulders, that whoever wrote this list had clearly been through this exact night before, had clearly sat in this exact chair listening to those exact footsteps, and had survived long enough afterward to write it all down in careful, deliberate handwriting so that whoever came after them would not have to guess. That thought should have made me feel better, proof that people had made it through this before. But it did the opposite because it meant every single rule on that page had been paid for by someone finding out the hard way. What happened if they broke it? I checked the time on my phone. No signal, no bars at all now, just the clock. And it read 11:40, which meant I still had more than 6 hours left before sunrise. 6 hours of sitting in a stranger's cabin, obeying a list of rules I had no way to verify, waiting for whatever was upstairs or outside, or both, to decide what it wanted to do next. That was when I heard my name. It came from outside, past the front porch, and it was not a shout, it was almost gentle, the way someone calls out when they already expect you to be close by. And it used my full name, the one only my mother and a handful of old friends still use, not the shortened version I go by with everyone else. I froze with the paper still in my hands, the flashlight beam trembling slightly against the floor, and for one long second my brain did exactly what I imagine it was designed to do. It searched for a normal explanation, a hiker who saw my truck on the road, a hunter checking the cabin, someone who somehow knew who I was. But nobody out here would know my full name. Nobody knew where I was at all. I had not told a single person I was taking this road. The last text I sent before my signal dropped was to my dispatcher, and it only said running late, and hearing that specific name called out into the dark from somewhere past a tree line 11 miles from the nearest town told me everything I needed to know about how impossible this was supposed to be. The rule was clear enough that I did not need to read it again. Do not answer. Do not look through the windows. And whatever I did, do not tell the voice that I knew it was not human. And that last part sat strange in my chest, because it implied the voice was listening closely enough to know the difference between fear and recognition. It called my name again, a little closer this time, and there was something underneath it now, a faint waver, like a recording slightly out of sync with itself, close enough to sound right if I was not paying attention, wrong enough that if I focused on it my skin crawled. I thought about my mother's voice specifically, because that was who it sounded closest to, the exact pitch she uses when she is standing at the bottom of the stairs telling me dinner is ready. And some old animal part of my brain wanted so badly to answer that voice out of pure habit that I had to press my lips together and dig my fingernails into my palm to stop the reflex. I kept my eyes down, away from the windows, and I noticed for the first time that the curtains in this cabin were heavier than I expected for a hunting cabin. Thick dark fabric, pulled fully closed across every window, I could see from where I sat. And I understood now why that mattered, because if I had glanced up out of instinct, there would have been nothing between me and whatever was standing out there calling my name. The voice called a third time, and this time it added something. My name, followed by a question, asking if I was awake, phrased exactly the way my mother used to ask when I was a teenager staying up too late, and the familiarity of it was somehow worse than if it had screamed, because it meant whatever this was had either studied me closely enough to know that phrasing, or had pulled it directly out of some memory that was not supposed to be accessible to anything standing outside a cabin in the woods. I did not answer. I sat completely still with the quilt around my shoulders and my eyes fixed on the kitchen table, counting my own breaths, just to give my mind something steady to hold on to, and slowly, over the course of what felt like several minutes, but was probably closer to one, the voice stopped calling. The silence that followed it felt heavier than before. Not the same kind of quiet as earlier in the night. This was the kind of quiet that made me feel watched, like something had simply stopped speaking instead of walking away. That was when I noticed the curtain over the small side window near the kitchen, the one closest to where I was sitting, had shifted. It was not fully open, but there was a gap now, maybe 4 or 5 inches wide, where before it had been pulled completely shut, and I had not touched it, had not gone near that side of the room since I sat down, which meant it had opened on its own sometime, while I was focused on the voice outside. I remembered the rule about the curtains almost instantly. If you notice one has opened by itself, do not close it immediately, wait exactly 10 seconds, because something outside may be standing directly in front of the window. And if you close the curtain while it is there, it will know where you are. Every instinct in my body wanted to reach over and yank that curtain shut, to remove the gap, to remove the possibility of anything looking through it. But I made myself sit with my hands flat on the table instead, counting seconds in my head, 1, 2, 3, forcing myself to go slow, because I did not trust my own sense of time in a moment like that. By the time I reached 10, I had not looked toward the window even once, keeping my eyes on the far wall instead, and only after I finished counting did I let myself reach over, slow and steady, and pull the curtain fully closed again. My fingers cold against the heavy fabric, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Nothing happened. No sound from outside, no shift in the fabric, nothing pressing against the glass from the other side, and I sat back down carefully, letting out a breath I did not realize I had been holding the entire time. I looked at the paper again, at the handwriting that had clearly been through a night like this before. And for the first time since I walked up that overgrown driveway, I found myself wondering not just how many people had survived this cabin, but how many had not, and whether the ones who had not were the reason the ones who had knew exactly what to write down. The wind outside had died down some, the pressure against the windows less constant now, and for a short while the cabin actually felt still, almost normal, the kind of quiet that made me start to believe maybe the worst of the night had already passed. Then, from the front porch, slow and deliberate, I heard the first knock. The knock landed heavy against the front door, a single deep sound that seemed to move through the floorboards under my feet. And I sat frozen, with the quilt still wrapped around my shoulders, my eyes locked on the door, even though I already knew from the rules that watching it would not tell me anything useful. A second knock followed a few seconds later. Same weight, same slow rhythm, and I found myself counting without meaning to, my mind automatically reaching for the rule about 3 knocks before I had even fully processed what was happening. The third knock came, and then nothing. I remembered the line clearly now. 3 knocks are not a request to enter. After the third knock, wait. If I heard nothing for 10 seconds, I was supposed to stay away from the door. And if a fourth knock came after that, I was supposed to hide somewhere inside the cabin. I started counting again, the same way I had with the curtain, forcing myself to go slow. 1, 2, 3, my hands pressed flat against the table to keep them from shaking. 4, 5, 6, the cabin silent except for the low creak of wind moving through the trees outside. 7, 8, 9, and right as I reached 10, thinking maybe this time nothing else would come, I heard it. A fourth knock, softer than the first 3, almost hesitant, like something testing whether I was still listening. I stood up from the table as quietly as I could, the quilt falling from my shoulders onto the chair behind me, and I looked around the cabin for somewhere to go, somewhere that was not near the front door or the windows, and my eyes landed on the small door beside the fireplace, the one I had guessed led down to a basement. I did not open it. I remembered the line from earlier in the rules, about the room I might not remember seeing when I first arrived, and even though I was fairly sure I had noticed that basement door the moment I walked in, the fear of being wrong about that, of pulling open a door to somewhere I had not actually accounted for, kept my feet rooted where they were. Instead, I moved toward the hallway near the bedroom, pressing myself into the narrow space between the doorway and an old wooden dresser pushed against the wall, low enough that I would not be visible from the front room if someone or something came inside. For a long stretch after that fourth knock, there was nothing. No fifth knock, no footsteps on the porch, no shifting of the door latch, just the wind and the sound of my own breathing, which I was trying hard to keep slow, and even though my chest wanted to do the opposite. I do not know exactly how long I crouched there in that hallway, but at some point the silence broke, not with a knock this time, but with a voice coming from just outside the front door, low and even, saying my name the same way the voice from the woods had said it earlier, except this one did not sound like my mother. It sounded like me. Not close to my voice, not similar, exactly my voice, the same pitch, the same rhythm I use when I am talking to myself while working through a problem, calling my own name out from the other side of that door like it was asking permission to come inside using a key it had somehow taken directly from my throat. I remembered the exact line from the paper almost instantly. If you hear your own voice knocking from the other side, get into the bedroom and lock the bedroom door. Do not come out until sunrise, and my body reacted before my mind had fully finished processing the instruction, moving low and fast into the bedroom, pulling the door shut behind me with both hands to keep it from making noise, and turning the small lock above the handle until I heard it click into place. The bedroom was small, one window on the far wall with the same heavy curtains pulled shut, a bed with a plain quilted cover, and a narrow closet door standing slightly open on the opposite side, and I backed myself into the corner between the bed and the wall, as far from both the door and the window as the room allowed. My knees pulled up against my chest. From the other side of the bedroom door, my own voice spoke again, quieter now, almost conversational, saying that it was cold outside and asking if I was going to let it in. And hearing that phrase come out in a tone I recognized as something I might actually say made my stomach turn in a way I had not expected. Worse than fear, something closer to violation. Like some part of me had been studied and copied down to the smallest detail. I did not answer. I pressed my back harder into the corner, watching the thin line of light under the bedroom door, waiting to see if it would shift, if a shadow would break it, if the doorknob would turn, and for a long stretch nothing did, the voice outside falling quiet again, leaving only the wind and the occasional groan of the cabin settling around me. Then, faint but unmistakable, I heard the front door creak open. I had left it unlocked, the way the first rule instructed, and I understood now that the rule had never promised nothing would come inside, only that locking it would guarantee something worse, and lying there in that corner with the bedroom door locked between me and whatever had just walked into the cabin, I finally understood exactly how thin a line I was standing on, one where following every rule perfectly still meant sharing a roof with something that knew my name, my voice, and apparently my mother's voice as well. Footsteps moved slowly across the front room floor, deliberate, unhurried, the kind of pace that told me whatever it was did not feel the need to search quickly because it already knew exactly where I had gone. The footsteps stopped somewhere near the kitchen table, close enough that I could picture exactly where it was standing. Right where I had been sitting only minutes earlier, right next to the paper with the rules written on it. And the thought of that made my stomach twist in a new way, because if it could read, if it understood what was written there, the same way I did, then it knew exactly how close it already was to getting what it wanted. I stayed pressed into the corner of the bedroom, knees against my chest, watching the thin strip of light under the door, and for a long stretch nothing moved. No shadow crossed the gap, no sound came from the front room at all. Just a silence so complete it felt like the whole cabin was holding its breath along with me. Then the footsteps started again, slower this time, moving toward the hallway, toward the bedroom door, and I felt my whole body go rigid, every muscle locking up as the steps grew closer, until they stopped directly on the other side of the door I had locked only minutes before. I did not breathe. The doorknob turned, just slightly, a small metallic click as it reached the end of its rotation against the lock, and held there, not forcing, not rattling, just testing, like it was making sure the lock was real before deciding what to do about it. A long pause followed, long enough that I started to wonder if it had already left without me noticing. And then, low and even, my own voice spoke again from the other side of the door, quieter than before, almost intimate, saying that it only wanted to talk, that it was not going to hurt me, that I could open the door and everything would be fine. Every word of it sounded exactly like something I could imagine myself saying to calm someone else down. The same reassuring tone I use with my mother when she gets anxious about something small, and hearing it aimed back at me through a locked door made my skin crawl in a way none of the earlier sounds had managed. I stayed silent, pressing my lips together, focusing on the rule instead of the voice, "Do not come out until sunrise," and I repeated that single sentence in my head over and over like it was the only solid thing left in the room. The doorknob released, the small click of it returning to its resting position, and the footsteps moved away from the door, back down the hallway, back toward the front room, unhurried the entire time. Like whatever it was had all the patience in the world, and no real urgency about getting what it came for tonight. I do not know how long I sat there after that, my back against the wall, listening for any sign it had come back, but at some point exhaustion started pulling at me despite the fear, the kind of bone-deep tiredness that comes after hours of adrenaline with nowhere for it to go, and I fought against closing my eyes, even as my body kept insisting. I must have drifted at some point, because the next thing I was aware of was a change in the quality of the dark around the edges of the curtain. Not full daylight yet, but the deep blue-gray that comes right before the sun actually breaks the horizon, and my heart jumped with a strange mix of relief and disbelief that I had actually made it through most of the night still in one piece. I stayed in the corner a while, longer, even after I noticed the light, not trusting the change enough to move right away, listening hard for footsteps, for breathing, for anything that would tell me the cabin was not as empty as the silence suggested. And when I finally did hear something, it was not footsteps at all. It was birds, faint and distant, the ordinary sound of a forest waking up outside. I unlocked the bedroom door slowly, easing it open an inch at a time, ready to shut it again the second I saw anything wrong. But the hallway beyond it was empty, lit by the pale gray light coming through the gaps around the curtains in the front room. I stepped out carefully, my legs stiff from hours spent curled in the corner, and made my way toward the kitchen table, where the paper still sat exactly where I had left it, held down by the chipped mug, undisturbed as far as I could tell, though I noticed my flashlight had been moved a few inches from where I remembered leaving it, now sitting closer to the edge of the table than before. I picked the paper up again, my hands still not entirely steady, and read through it once more in the growing light, my eyes catching on the final rule I had not yet needed to think about, the one about leaving in the morning. At sunrise you may leave, but before you do, walk through every room and make sure no one is inside. Do not skip the attic. Do not skip the basement. And if you find a room you do not remember seeing when you arrived, do not enter it. Close the door, leave the cabin, and whatever happens next, do not look back at the cabin from the road. I looked toward the small door beside the fireplace, the one I still was not fully certain I had noticed the moment I first walked in, and then toward the narrow staircase leading up into the attic. Both of them sitting there in the pale morning light, waiting for me to do exactly what the rule required before. I would be allowed to walk away from this place for good. I set the paper back down on the table, my hands still not quite steady, and told myself that the sooner I checked every room, the sooner I could walk out that front door and put this whole night behind me. So I started with the space closest to me, the small door beside the fireplace, the one I still was not 100% sure I had actually noticed the moment I first walked in. I stood in front of it for a moment, running back through my memory of arriving, the couch, the kitchen table, the two chairs pushed in neat, and yes, I was almost certain I remembered glancing at this door and guessing it led down to a basement, almost certain, which was the part that bothered me, because almost certain was not the same as sure. I decided the rule meant a door I had absolutely no memory of, not a door I was only slightly unsure about, and with that reasoning settled enough to move my hand, I pulled it open. A narrow wooden staircase led down into darkness, plain dirt walls on either side, the air coming up from below noticeably colder than the rest of the cabin. And I clicked my flashlight on before starting down, testing each step with my weight before trusting it fully, since the wood looked old enough that a rotted board would not have surprised me. The basement was smaller than I expected, one open room with a dirt floor, a few empty shelves built into the far wall, and nothing else, no boxes, no old furniture. No sign that anyone had used this space for anything in a very long time, and I swept the flashlight beam into every corner twice, just to be sure before heading back up the stairs and pulling the door shut behind me. Next was the narrow staircase leading up to the attic, tucked into the corner past the bedroom doorway. The same place I had listened to those slow, deliberate footsteps crossing back and forth the night before, and my stomach tightened just looking at it, knowing I was about to climb up into the exact space that sound had come from. I told myself the rule was clear. Do not skip the attic, and reminded myself that it was sunrise now, that the birds outside were still going, that whatever had been active in the dark hours of the night operated by rules of its own that presumably did not include broad daylight, though nothing on that paper had actually promised me that. And I realized as I put my foot on the first step that I was building a comfort out of assumptions nobody had confirmed. The attic stairs creaked under each step, louder than the basement ones had, and the space at the top was cramped. Low ceiling forcing me to duck. A single small window at the far end letting in a thin gray beam of morning light that caught dust hanging still in the air. There was almost nothing up there, an old trunk pushed against the wall, empty when I checked it. Some loose insulation between the rafters, and a section of floorboard near the window that looked slightly different from the rest, a shade lighter, like it had been replaced at some point, though I could not tell how recently. I crouched down and pressed my palm against it, and it held firm, no give, no hollow sound underneath when I knocked on it lightly with my knuckle. So I decided it was nothing, just old repair work from whoever last owned this place, and I made my way back down the stairs, my legs grateful to be able to stand fully upright again once I reached the hallway. That left the bedroom, the room I had already spent most of the night locked inside of, and I stepped back in expecting nothing new, running my eyes over the same bed, the same narrow closet with its door still slightly open, the same single window with its heavy curtain pulled shut. I walked over and checked the closet properly this time, pulling the door fully open, finding only a few empty wire hangers swinging slightly from the motion. No clothes, no boxes, nothing hidden in the shadows at the back, and I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. That left one more space, the front room itself, which I had technically already been standing in the entire time, but I made myself walk its full perimeter anyway, checking behind the couch, behind the kitchen chairs, along the base of the curtains to make sure nothing was tucked against the wall beneath them. And everything came back the same, empty, ordinary, ready. I was reaching for my bag, ready to sling it over my shoulder and finally leave, when something caught the corner of my eye near the hallway, past the bedroom doorway, on the same wall as the attic stairs. A section of wall I was almost certain had been solid the night before. A plain stretch of wood paneling with nothing on it. Now there was a door, a plain wooden door, unremarkable except for the fact that I had walked past that exact stretch of wall at least half a dozen times over the course of the night, and never once seen anything there but flat paneling. And I stood frozen a few feet from my bag, staring at it, running through every possible explanation my mind could offer. Poor lighting, exhaustion, a trick of shadow from the flashlight, none of which felt convincing even as I tried to talk myself into them. I thought about the rule immediately. If you find a room you do not remember seeing when you arrived, do not enter it, close the door, leave the cabin. And I noticed that this door was not closed. It was open, just slightly, a dark gap of maybe 2 inches running down the side, not enough to see anything inside, but enough that I could feel a thin current of colder air drifting out from whatever space sat on the other side of it. I stood there staring at that 2-inch gap of darkness for longer than I should have, my mind trying to force some rational explanation into place. A shadow that only looked like a doorway, a trick of the low morning light bouncing wrong off the paneling, but none of it held up against what I was actually seeing, a plain wooden door standing where a solid wall had been every other time I passed that hallway. The rule was simple enough. Close the door, leave the cabin, do not enter, and I told myself that following it exactly was the only thing standing between me and whatever mistake had gotten someone else's name added to whatever list of people never made it out of a night like this. I took a step toward it anyway, not to go inside, just close enough to reach the edge and pull it shut, my arm already extending before my brain fully agreed to the movement. And as my fingers closed around the edge of the door, I felt the cold air drifting through the gap grow noticeably stronger, like whatever space was behind it had expanded or come closer. I did not look through the gap. I kept my eyes fixed on the door frame itself, on the wood grain, on the small brass hinge holding it in place. Anything except the dark sliver where the door had not quite met the frame. And I pulled it shut with one steady motion, the latch clicking into place with a sound that felt disproportionately loud in the quiet of the cabin. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, faint, from directly behind that door, I heard something shift, not a footstep exactly, more like weight settling, the kind of sound a person makes when they lean back against a wall after standing still for a long time, and my hand was still resting flat against the door when I felt it, the faintest pressure from the other side. Not a knock, not a push, just contact, like something had leaned its full weight against the same spot my palm was touching. I pulled my hand back like the wood had gone hot, and I did not wait to see if anything else would happen. I turned, grabbed my bag from beside the kitchen table, and walked straight for the front door, my legs moving faster than I meant them to, my whole body suddenly desperate to be outside in the actual daylight, instead of standing in a room with a door that had not existed the night before. The front door was still unlocked, the way it had been the entire night, and I pulled it open and stepped out onto the porch, the cold morning air hitting my face in a way that felt almost shockingly normal after everything that had happened inside. The porch boards creaked under my feet the same way any old porch would. The overgrown driveway stretched out ahead of me toward the tree line and the road beyond it, and for a second, standing there in the pale gray light with birds calling somewhere in the branches, I let myself believe the worst part was actually behind me. I made it down the porch steps, onto the gravel path, my bag heavy on my shoulder, my legs stiff and aching from hours spent curled in a corner, and I kept my eyes forward, focused on the tree line, on the road I knew was waiting past it, refusing to let myself slow down even though every part of me wanted to stop and catch my breath. Whatever happens next, do not look back at the cabin from the road. That was the exact wording from the paper. And I had read it enough times over the course of the night that it had settled into my memory word for word. Because if I see someone standing in the doorway, I did not spend the night alone. I reached the edge of the driveway where it met the tree line, the gravel giving way to the packed dirt shoulder of the actual road, and I felt a strange pull in my chest the moment I crossed that line. An urge, sudden and specific, to turn around and check the cabin one last time. To confirm with my own eyes that the porch was empty, that nothing was standing in that doorway watching me walk away. I recognized the pull for exactly what it was. It was the same kind of urge I had felt at the front door the night before, the same kind of urge I had felt reaching for the curtain, a small, reasonable-sounding voice suggesting that just this once, just this last time, checking would not actually hurt anything, that the rule was probably more about panic than any real consequence, that I had already survived the worst of it, and one glance backward would not undo that. I kept walking. I focused on the road ahead of me instead, on the direction I remembered my truck being parked, on the 11 miles of empty back road still standing between me and the nearest town, and I did not let my head turn, not even slightly, even as the urge grew sharper behind my eyes the farther I got from the driveway. Behind me, faint but unmistakable in the still morning air, I heard the porch boards creak, the exact same sound my own feet had made only a minute earlier, the weight and rhythm of it close enough to a person's footstep that my whole body wanted to spin around and confirm what it was. I did not. I kept my eyes locked on the road ahead, my pace steady, my breathing controlled, walking further and further from the cabin with every step. The creak of those porch boards fading slowly behind me until the only sound left was my own footsteps on the gravel and the distant, ordinary calling of birds in the trees. The walk back down that empty road felt longer than the one that had brought me to the cabin, even though I knew it was the same. Distance and my legs moving on pure momentum, while my mind stayed fixed somewhere behind me, still half listening for porch boards that were no longer creaking, still half expecting a voice to call my name out of the trees one more time. None of that happened. The road stayed quiet except for my own footsteps and the occasional bird call, the morning light growing stronger with each passing minute, turning the gray tree line into something almost ordinary, the kind of scenery I would have driven past 100 times without a second thought, under any other circumstances. I found my truck exactly where I had left it, pulled off onto the gravel shoulder with the hood still propped open the way I had left it the night before, and the sight of it hit me with a wave of relief, so strong my knees actually went a little weak, because it meant I had a fixed point again, something familiar in a night that had stopped feeling like it belonged to the world I understood. I dropped my bag on the passenger seat and leaned over the engine, checking the same components I had checked the evening before. And for a moment I half expected the truck to still be broken, some part of me almost wanting a legitimate mechanical reason to explain why I had ended up walking into those woods in the first place. But when I climbed into the cab and turned the key, the engine caught on the first try, smooth and steady, no warning light, no hesitation, like nothing had ever been wrong with it at all. I sat there for a full minute with my hands on the wheel, engine idling, staring at the dashboard, running through the timeline in my head. The check engine light, the loss of power, the way it had died completely just far enough from town to force me toward that driveway, and none of it added up to a truck that would now start clean and run perfect without so much as a stutter. I did not have an explanation for that, and I decided, sitting there on that gravel shoulder with the engine humming under me, that I was not going to spend any more time trying to build one. I pulled back onto the road and drove the rest of the way into town with both hands locked on the wheel, checking my mirrors more than I normally would, though the road behind me stayed empty the whole way, nothing following, nothing standing at the tree line watching me go, just empty asphalt and morning fog burning off the fields on either side. By the time I reached the edge of town, my phone had a full signal again, and it buzzed almost immediately with a string of missed messages from my dispatcher, worried texts asking where I was, whether I had broken down, whether I needed someone sent out to find me. And I realized with a strange kind of guilt that nobody had actually noticed I was missing until well into the morning, that the entire night had passed with no one even aware I had not made it home. I called my dispatcher first, told him a half-true version of the story. Truck trouble on the back road, dead phone signal, spent the night parked on the shoulder waiting for daylight. And he accepted it easily enough, more relieved that I was fine than curious about the details, and I let that version stand because I did not know how to say the rest of it out loud yet, not to him, not to anyone. I stopped at a diner on the edge of town before heading the rest of the way home, mostly because I needed coffee in a few minutes, sitting somewhere with other people around me. Ordinary people eating breakfast, a cook calling out orders through a kitchen window, a waitress refilling cups without a second thought, and something about that noise, that completely unremarkable morning noise, settled something in my chest that had been tight since the moment I first heard my own voice calling through a locked bedroom door. While I sat there with my coffee, I pulled out my phone and searched the name of the road the cabin sat off of, half expecting nothing to come up, but a handful of old local news articles loaded instead, stories going back years, about hikers who had gone missing in that stretch of forest, about a search that had turned up an abandoned hunting cabin with no clear owner on record, about the property changing hands so many times through tax auctions that nobody local seemed to actually claim responsibility for it. None of the articles mentioned rules or a list, or any of what I had actually experienced, but one of them, dated almost 11 years back, included a short quote from a survivor who had apparently spent a night lost in that same stretch of woods and was found walking along this exact road the following morning, refusing to explain where he had slept, only telling the reporter that whatever happened out there, he had followed the instructions, and that was the only reason he made it back. I read that line 3 times, my coffee going cold in front of me, and I thought about the handwriting on that paper, dark and deliberate, clearly written by someone who had lived through exactly what I had. And I wondered, not for the first time that morning, how many other names belonged to that same list. How many people over however many years had walked up that same overgrown driveway looking for nothing more than shelter from a bad night, and found themselves instead sitting at that same kitchen table, reading the same warning, I paid for my coffee, left the diner, and got back into my truck, but I did not drive straight home. I drove instead to the edge of the county records office, waiting outside in the parking lot until it opened, because something about that article had lodged itself in my mind and would not let go. A small detail buried near the bottom of the piece, a mention that the cabin's last confirmed owner had died decades earlier under circumstances the article described only as unresolved, and I found myself needing to know exactly what that meant before I could let myself go home and try to sleep off a night. I still was not sure I fully understood. The records office was small, the kind of county building with fluorescent lights, and a single clerk working behind a counter that looked like it had not been updated since the 80s. And when the doors finally unlocked at 9, I was the first one through them, still in yesterday's clothes, still running on adrenaline instead of actual sleep. The clerk, an older woman with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, did not ask why I looked the way I did, which I appreciated, and when I gave her the rough location of the property off that back road, she typed for a while, frowned at her screen, and told me the parcel had bounced through 3 different tax auctions over the last 20 years, never held by the same owner for more than a season or 2 before, reverting back to the county. Before that, she said, it had belonged to one family for almost 40 years, a name I did not recognize, and when I asked what happened to them, she hesitated in a way that told me this was not the first time someone had asked her that same question. She pulled a thin folder from a back cabinet, official enough looking that I understood this was not just gossip she was pulling from memory, and read me the short version, that the property's last confirmed resident, an older man who had lived there alone for years after his wife passed, was reported missing by a nephew who came to check on him and found the cabin empty. No signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, his truck still parked outside, and a single sheet of paper sitting on the kitchen table that the nephew apparently found so disturbing, he refused to keep it and instead handed it over to the sheriff's department along with his statement. I felt my stomach drop somewhere around the word single sheet of paper, and I asked, as calmly as I could manage, whether that paper still existed anywhere, whether it had been kept with the file. She said no, that as far as she knew it had been logged once, and then lost somewhere between departments over the following years, the way old case documents sometimes are, but she remembered the file well enough, because it was one of the strange ones that got passed around the office informally for years afterward, the kind of case new employees get told about during slow shifts. According to what she remembered from the original report, the sheriff at the time had noted the paper contained a handwritten list the missing man's nephew described as rules for staying the night, and though the official case file listed the man as an unresolved missing person, the department's private theory, never written into any formal document, but repeated often enough to become part of local knowledge, was that he had simply walked off into the woods one night and never made it back. An old man alone, maybe confused, maybe unwell, nothing more mysterious than that. I asked her if there had been others since then, other names connected to that cabin, and she looked at me for a long moment before answering, the kind of look that told me she already suspected why I was asking in the first place. She said there had been a few spread out over the years, a hiker in the early 2000s, a hunter about 6 years after that, each case handled quietly, each one closed eventually as either a resolved disappearance with a mundane explanation, or in 2 cases, never resolved at all, and each time, if the responding officer happened to search the cabin, they noted finding a similar handwritten page on the kitchen table, though the specific wording was never recorded in detail, because nobody in an official capacity ever seemed to take it seriously enough to transcribe it word for word. I thanked her for her time, my hands cold despite the warmth of the office, and I left with more understanding than I had walked in with, but nowhere near the amount of clarity I had actually wanted. I drove home after that, finally, the adrenaline that had carried me through the night and the morning starting to wear thin, replaced by an exhaustion so complete I barely remembered the last few miles of the drive. And once I got inside my apartment, I did not bother eating, did not bother checking my phone again. I just locked the door, checked it twice out of a habit that felt different now than it had before last night, and slept for almost 14 hours straight. When I woke up, the light outside had gone gray again, evening settling in fast, the way it does in that part of the country, and for a moment, lying there in my own bed in my own apartment, the entire night at the cabin felt distant enough that I almost let myself believe I had exaggerated some of it in my memory, the way fear sometimes stretches details larger than they actually were. Then I reached for my phone to check the time, and saw a text sitting at the top of my messages, sent from an unknown number, no name attached, time-stamped almost exactly 12 hours after I had walked away from that driveway without looking back. It was a single line, no greeting, no explanation, just 7 words that made the sleep drain out of my body all at once. You forgot to check the basement shelves. I sat up in bed with the phone still in my hand, reading that message over and over. You forgot to check the basement shelves. 7 words that should not have meant anything, since I remembered standing in that basement clearly, sweeping the flashlight across every empty shelf built into the far wall, twice, just to be sure. I tried calling the number back immediately, and it rang once before going straight to a flat automated message, telling me the number was no longer in service, which did nothing to slow the cold feeling spreading through my chest, because a number that could send a text but not receive a call back felt less like a mistake and more like a door being closed on purpose right after it had been opened just long enough to say what it needed to say. I told myself, sitting there in the dark of my own bedroom, that I was not going back. I had followed every rule I understood. I had made it out. I had walked away without looking back at that cabin from the road, and whatever was left unfinished behind me, whatever sat on those basement shelves that I apparently had not actually seen clearly enough, was not something I owed a second visit to confirm. That conviction lasted about 2 days. It was not curiosity that changed my mind. Not exactly. It was something closer to a low, constant unease that followed me through everything else I tried to do. A feeling that the night was not actually finished the way I wanted it to be, that walking away had only closed the door partway instead of all the way shut, and that the message sitting unanswered in my phone was less a taunt and more an unfinished piece of the same rule system I had spent a whole night obeying without fully understanding. I went back during the middle of the day, not at night, with a friend from work who I told a heavily edited version of the story to. Enough that he understood I did not want to go alone. Not enough that he asked too many questions about why, and we drove out together in his truck, since mine had sat fine ever since that morning. No more warning lights, no more loss of power, exactly the kind of detail I had decided not to think about too hard. The cabin looked smaller in full daylight, less like something waiting and more like what it actually was underneath everything else. An old structure sitting quiet at the end of an overgrown driveway, paint peeling slightly at the corners of the window frames in a way I had not noticed in the dark. The front door was unlocked, same as I had left it, and inside everything sat exactly the way I remembered. The couch, the kitchen table, the fireplace with its untouched stack of dry wood, though the paper with the rules was gone from the table now. No chipped mug holding anything down, just bare woodware. Had been. I checked the wall near the attic stairs first, the spot where that extra door had appeared the last morning, and found nothing there now but flat paneling, solid under my hand, no seam, no hinge, nothing to suggest a door had ever existed in that spot at all. And my friend watched me press my palm against that section of wall with a confused look that told me he had no context for why I would be doing that, which was fine, because I did not offer one. The basement stairs creaked the same way they had before, and I went down slower this time, flashlight in hand even with daylight coming through the small window at ground level, and I walked straight to the shelves built into the far wall, running my hand along each one, checking behind the support brackets, checking underneath where the bottom shelf met the dirt floor. On the lowest shelf, pushed back far enough that the flashlight beam had clearly missed it the first time, tucked into the dark space where the wood met the wall, I found a small metal tin, rusted at the edges, the kind of container that might have once held tobacco or matches. Inside it, folded into a small tight square, was another piece of paper, different handwriting from the one I had read that night, older, more cramped, and when I unfolded it carefully, I found not a list of rules this time, but a name, a date decades old, and a single line beneath it that read, "If you found this, you already made it out once. That means the cabin let you go. Do not test that twice." I did not need my friend to tell me it was time to leave. I could see it on his face the moment I straightened back up with that tin in my hand, both of us moving toward the stairs at the same time, without either of us saying anything about it out loud. We walked back out through the front room, out onto the porch, down the steps, and across the overgrown driveway toward his truck. And this time, in full daylight, with company beside me, I let myself glance back once toward the cabin before we reached the road. Nothing stood in the doorway, just an empty porch, an empty window, a structure that looked, in that ordinary afternoon light, like nothing more than an old cabin someone had once loved, and then lost, sitting quiet in the woods the same way it probably had, for years before I ever stumbled onto its driveway, and would probably continue sitting long after I drove away from it for good. I still have that tin sitting in a drawer in my apartment, the folded paper inside it, the name and the date I have never tried to look up, because some part of me understands now that certain doors are better left checked once and then closed for good, and that whatever system runs underneath that stretch of woods does not need me to understand it completely in order for me to respect it. And every time I drive that particular backroad now, which I try not to do more than I have to, I keep my eyes forward, my tank full, and I never, under any circumstances, let it get low enough to leave me stranded anywhere near that driveway again.